All right. So we carry on. We are on towards the bottom of page 46, and you'll see a subheading there entitled Shackles Old and New. And here you can write B, Italian cinema. So we spoke about Italian arts and culture a little bit. Now we are drifting down towards Italian cinema. So next to Shackles Old and New, you can write B, Italian cinema. Right, and the subheading kind of you want to also say next to Italian cinema or Shackles Old and New is that this writing culture carries on. So this writing culture inherited from art, literature, and Italian society in general just funnels through to cinema. So cinema makes an appearance at some point in Italy, but instead of saying, my goodness, look, here's this kind of new technical form, here's this new technology, we could use this absolutely brand new technology to tell stories differently, they just carry on that writing culture and transpose it into cinema. So now we're going to read just underneath that heading, Shackles Old and New, on page 46. It was generally against the background previously described that the movie industry came into being in Italy at the beginning of the century. Right? Thus, rather than being accepted as a new medium, that's very important, as a new medium that could, unhampered by existing traditions, start afresh to explore and dramatize in a visual manner feelings, passions, and customs of a country that had at last found its independence, the movie camera was used to exploit once again a glorious past that had lost much of its glow since it had been changed from a living reality into a meaningless myth. So as we said up front, this new form or this new technology, uh, this new mode of expressing art comes into being in Italy, the movies or cinema comes into Italy, but instead of using it for something positive and different and seeing the potential in it, what they simply do is that they just carry on that old pattern, right? They carry on that old pattern. That's something very interesting for us to also think about. This is a little bit of a tangent, but in terms of digital media studies, all these new technologies we've inherited, especially with the shutdown and our shift online, will we be doing things differently, or are we simply going to be repeating our same errors in a new technological infrastructure? Something to think about. Right, so we turned the page, we said, right, okay, so here comes this new stuff. The movies have finally reached Italy. They could do something good with it, but they don't. Let's see what they do with it. Right, page 47. Um, what do they do? What's the first thing they do? Top of page 47. The long list of historical films made in the early part of the century testifies to this desire of playing up to the greatness of Italy. So take a look at these films. It's all about, again, as usual, a glorification of the past. Quo Vadis, Cabiria, Neroni, The Last Days of Pompeii, and countless other spectaculars, certainly impressive for their contribution to the technique of movie making, represent, more than attempts showing what the medium was capable of, works whose true value could be carefully measured not in terms of form and meaning, but in dollars and cents. Right, very interesting. We go to the next paragraph. And okay, so from that first paragraph, just to recap, we again learned, yes, it's all about that glorification of Italy. You are using this new medium for telling exactly the same stories you always have. You haven't done anything new with this new medium. So second paragraph, things are going to change a little bit. Crises. So page 47, paragraph 2. Crises always test the strength of leadership, and the crises provoked by the First World War, political and economic, and the chaos that ensued proved beyond any doubt that the leadership of the Italian cinema was at best of a very temporary nature. Most of the equipment and sets used to make movies were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Raw materials became increasingly harder to buy without a stable currency, and American and German movies flooded Italy and were found appealing by an audience that had grown accustomed to being fed extravaganzas of the historical type. It was necessary to start all over again. Not until the early 30s did the process of reconstruction begin. However, with the opening of Cinecittà Studios in the vicinity of Rome and the experimental center of cinematography, where actors, directors, and technicians began receiving training whose full value was not to be appreciated until several years later. The Italian cinema could actually have experienced some kind of rejuvenation. So they had a chance to do something interesting. Let's see what happens. Let's see if they manage to do something interesting. If you know your history and you're listening to that term 1930s, you know that something good is not going to happen. In fact, it's going to be the precise opposite. Something pretty bad is going to happen, and that something bad has a particular name. It's the name Benito Mussolini. Right, so remember we said something good could have happened. There could have been some kind of rejuvenation for Italian cinema. Let's see what happens. Next paragraph. So we're kind of towards the bottom of 47. By the middle 30s, the cinema too began feeling the stifling impact of censorship. Oh dear. It became first hazardous, then altogether impossible to deal with. Suicide, moral and political aberration, social or religious themes, sabotage, discontent. Italy, so dictated her master. And here we're talking about Mussolini and the fascist government that had taken control of Italy. So Italy, so dictated her master, must be depicted as morally and physically sane, clean, and happy. So all film essentially had to become propaganda, right? All film had to say, Italy, there's nothing wrong here. This is the perfect country. There's no suffering. There's no deprivation. Nobody's having a bad time. Not only do we have this glorious past, but the present is as glorious as the past was. Everything in this country is perfectly fine. Bottom of page 47. Because the Italian artist was no longer able, let alone willing, to deal with the raw stuff of life, he became lax and shallow, often allowing the cinema to degenerate in the hands of the fascists into an inefficient and puerile instrument of official propaganda. So this is kind of all bad news. We said we had a lot of criticisms of Italian art, Italian culture, Italian society. We saw how that fed into cinema, into Italian cinema. And now we get to a really proper dead end, right? Now cinema just becomes propaganda. It becomes the plaything of Benito Mussolini, right? Sad stuff. That is the fate it seemed to have suffered. But something is going to turn. So here on page 48, you'll see a subheading called Stirrings. And in other words, you can say this is the turn. Something's starting to change. These are kind of the seeds that are being sown for something different to happen in terms of cinema in the country. Let's take a look. Right, there's always hope, and now we're going to start looking into the hope. So the first part of the article, the first part of the Pachafici article, it paints this very, very bleak picture. Things are looking very, very bad. There's nothing positive that's been said yet, but now we are on the other side of the equation. So let's see if something good can come of this, right? Let's see if something good can come of this. Not very professional, but I'm going to just take a quick hit of my vape. All right, it's decent. I think I'll take one more. Okay. Right, so stirrings. Let's take a look. Page 48, stirrings, the turn, the positive side of the equation. Yet the waters were not completely stagnant. Witness the fact that several intellectuals, without special allegiance to any particular group, disgusted by the emptiness prevailing in the culture of their day and by the rhetoric of its form, began a crucial search for a style through which they could articulate once again some of the problems that had been drowned by the fanfare of the official propaganda. Right, so even though pretty much everybody was conforming to this propaganda, was producing these films that glorified Italy past and present, there were some people that were quite unhappy with this and were looking for something else, right? They were looking for a different way to produce art, or a different way to produce literature or cinema. And then something kind of fortuitous happens. There's kind of a lucky break. There's something that doesn't seem very good up front, but then has positive impacts for these guys searching for a unique style, something that could really be truly Italian and express the real Italy in their opinion. Right, so we are at the bottom of page 48 to find this, kind of 6 lines from the bottom. Okay, 6 lines from the bottom, and you'll see it says the war in Ethiopia. Right, so there's a war in Ethiopia 35-36. 3 years before the start of the Second World War, right, on the 1st of September 1939. We talk about the war in Ethiopia. What happens there? The war in Ethiopia, too, contributed to a revision of traditional techniques as it forced Italian film directors to work outside a geographical and cultural context within which they had been raised and which had always been available to them. So very quickly, kind of history 101, 1935-36, this war in Ethiopia was called Abyssinia at the time, and it was kind of like an Italian colony, right? The Italians had, in a sense, colonized it, and then there was an uprising there. So the Italian army found itself, traveling off to Ethiopia to fight against those seeking some sort of independence or a break from Italian domination. Working far away from their native country, forced to use untrained actors and rely on improvised methods, they were challenged by the possibility of an approach that would give them the opportunity of shedding some light upon the life of strange people, long considered barbarians. Remember, this is the 30s, but who claimed an interesting heritage of their own that warranted careful scrutiny. Right, so when these guys got there with the Italian army, when they had to film propaganda for the Italian army in Ethiopia, they found that, my goodness, this is really kind of strange. These people we were told were a certain thing aren't exactly that. They're something very, very different. They're very interesting people of great depth. When I do my filming, I have to kind of improvise. I have to come up with all sorts of things, right? And so you can see that these things are going to start becoming the seeds or the kernel for the idea of Italian neo-realism, right? There was these guys, these filmmakers that were there with the army in Ethiopia, Abyssinia. They had to suddenly rely on different techniques. They had to do things very, very differently, and it kind of lodged the thought in their minds. Right, here we go. It says so here, page 49. Through this experience, the focus underwent a shift. It was not necessarily the conventional situation of the Italian middle class that needed exploiting, but the very nature of man in general, and of Italian man in particular. It was this man who, living in a certain economic, social, and political milieu, obsessed by certain desires and ambitions, afflicted by certain longings, was totally unknown to the Italian audience, aka the regular, ordinary, everyday person was completely unknown to Italian audiences, right? And that regular person with desires, with pain, with all these different things that afflict all of us, right, was also a person that was universal. It was a universal human experience. In dramatizing his situation, the artist was not to lose sight of the fact that it must be done in such a way as to draw ultimately the moral issues involved in living that particular life, and thus be concerned with the overriding questions of good and evil that are the proper concern of any serious artist. Right. So a shift in thinking. Something's happening. People are starting to think perhaps we should use cinema in a different manner. Right at the bottom of 49. Movies such as Piccolo, Mondo Antica, and Ossessione accomplished far more than demonstrating the validity and correctness of shooting on location. The achievement consists perhaps in their having vividly and concretely presented for the first time in many a decade a part of the Italian landscape and life in its misery and brutality and humanity that previous film directors had carefully avoided because it was in direct contradiction with the teachings of fascism and the false view of life it had tried to promulgate for almost 20 years. Right. Very, very interesting. Right. So remember, we said Italian cinema in general, Italian art, culture, society, it didn't like to muck around with that sort of stuff, right? Misery, brutality, humanity. It wasn't interested in those things. It was interested in that which they believed to be transcendental, right? And for the first time, these movies start to come out and they start to look at that ugly side of life that unfortunately exists. Top of 50, it was only in 1943 that the various tendencies were brought together and given some sort of direction. And that's when we get to the third part of the lecture on page 50, and that's the breakthrough. The breakthrough. So finally, there's some sort of breakthrough. The stirrings had happened, and now the breakthrough has come. So next to the breakthrough, you can write C, Italian neo-realism.